Welcome to the annual Big Theory Conference. We have gathered here today five of the most influential writers of our times: Edward Said, Jacques Lacan, Gloria Anzaldúa, Jacques Derrida, and Ferdinand de Saussure. These are the major contributors to philosophy and critical theory. Let's start with the distinguished Edward Said. Professor Said, what kind of question does Orientalism try to answer?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, if not an honor. Well, Orientalism tries to answer the question of why is it that when we think of the Middle East, for example, we have this preconceived notion of what kind of people live there, how they act, their behavior, what is their belief system, even though we may have never set foot in their land. But more generally, Orientalism asks how we come to understand these people and the strangers that...
Discussion with Professor of Geneva, Ferdinand de Saussure. Can you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yeah, well, what I've come up with was the idea of a sound in the signifier and signified and signifier, and the idea of a concept with being the signified and the sound image being the signifier. And the psychological character of a sound image is apparent when we speak to ourselves, and because we regard the words of language as sound image, we must avoid speaking of the phonemes, and words themselves are sound image. That's it.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to take questions from our distinguished panel, and any questions for Professor Ferdinand?
Yes, I had a question. So, in your view, how do you define a symbol?
The word symbol has been used to designate the linguistic sign, or more specifically, what is here called the signifier.
Any more questions? Thank you very much. The panel, do you guys have any more questions?
I do. What exactly is this ideological hegemony in the West that you speak of in your essay?
Well, I've actually addressed the idea of cultural hegemony in the West. I've used Anthony Gramsci, who has made a very useful distinction between civil and political society. The former, which consists of voluntary affiliations, such as schools, families, unions, churches, etc., etc. And the latter is made of state institutions such as the army, the police, the CIA. So cultural hegemony operates under civil society. It is this hegemony that gives Orientalism its strength. It is its backbone, basically.
Thank you. Next, I would like to introduce Jacques Lacan, the most controversial figure in French psychiatry. Can you tell us something about your work?
Yes, I've done quite a few things regarding psychology, but most importantly, though, I did work on this thing I came up with called the mirror stage. And basically, it's how, starting with an infant, unlike, let's say, like a chimp, for instance, right away, we, as babies, we immediately recognize ourselves in the mirror, our own reflection, and we get an image of ourselves. And then, as we grow older, we have these outside sources, you could say, that affect our perception of ourself. And so I kind of talk about that in my essay, the progression of that, and the progression of ourself.
Okay, thank you very much. The panel, do you guys have any questions for Professor Jacques?
Yes, so exactly what is an image? It's obviously something related to...
Well, the image and the word I came up with, the imagos, it's basically how we perceive ourselves, what we see in the mirror when we look in there, and it could be affected by our experiences from outside, from our life experiences, just from different things. And as you get older through these different stages of life, that image changes, fluctuates.
Thank you very much. Any more questions?
I actually had a question. In your paper, you talk about the Gestalt, and you say that it is more constituent than constituted. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, well, basically that a Gestalt should be capable of formative effects in the organism is attested by a piece of biological experimentation that is itself so alien to the idea of psychical causality that cannot bring itself to formulate its results in these terms.
Thank you very much. And next, I would like to introduce Mr. Jacques Derrida, the father of deconstruction, and one of the most important voices of postmodernism. Could you tell us about your work and about yourself?
Yeah. Basically, my work investigates what I call the metaphysics of presence in the West. Basically, the way we think about things, the way we think about language and semiotics and signs, are all based on the supposition that at the center there is some kind of transcendental signified, something that's like a lens that makes everything else make sense. Now, we've called this thing God in the past, we've called it science, but this is the way that the West makes sense of things. I also outline how the way it does this is through binary oppositions. Good as opposed to bad, where good is always on top, or black as opposed to white, where white is always on top. I believe that by deconstructing these binaries, we can come up with new ways of thinking and understanding the world.
Thank you very much. Panel, do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, actually I have a question. How does the concept of centering relate to the reconstruction of the Orient by the West?
Right, well, I think Orientalism is a really good example of how the West uses different centers when it constructs other cultures, for example. Like, the center of an Orientalist text is the West, right? It's the way the West views the Orient. And I outline in my work that structure, or rather the structurality of structure, although it's always been involved, it's always neutralized and reduced by a fixed origin. This fixed origin is what I call the center. In Orientalism, that would be the Western subject that's at the center of all knowledge.
Thank you very much. Any more questions from the panel?
Yes. So, Jacques, how can we make coalitions based on identity if identity only comes from difference?
Well, just because identity is a function of difference doesn't necessarily mean we can't still build coalitions amongst each other, right? Like, I talk about in my essay free play, which is the free interaction of different terms. So, for instance, what you think of as the self is not the result of a binary between like the self and the other. It's actually a free play of a bunch of different terms that help you theorize what a self is. I think that identities can work the same way. Like in your own essay, your Mestiza consciousness is an example of a free play that gets us outside of the binaries of black and white. And like, these are the kind of binaries that allow borderlands to be constructed, right? So I think that your own work gives us a really good example of how we can use how free play is the disruption of presence.
Do you have any questions from the panel for Miss Andalzoa? Thank you.
Why do you think machismo is grown within Mexican men?
Because I believe they have lost their own dignity. They have been put to shame, and they have lost their self-respect for themselves. So they feel the need to put women down and treat them badly. So they take it out on them. They mistreat them. They tell them that they're only good to cook, clean, and do things that that they're supposed to do, like housework. So they don't feel good about themselves, so they would rather just much put them down.
Thank you. Any more questions from our panel?
Yeah, I have a question. So what do you think causes a dual personality in the mind of the mestiza?
Well, you have spiritual values from the American culture, you have spiritual values from the Mexican culture. You're dealing with two cultures, and you sometimes don't know how to act. You're telling yourself that you have to act one way, like the American way. You go to school and you're acting the American way, but you go home to a home where you're growing up Mexican, so you don't know what to do. Your parents are telling you to do something, but society is telling you to do another. So that's where you have a battle between your both cultures.
Thank you very much. Any more questions from our panel?
I had one question. There's a great line in your paper where it says, we need to allow the white women into our alleys. What do you mean by that?
By that I mean that sometimes a person of color doesn't want to affiliate with a white person because they feel intimidated, or they feel like they feel like they're superior than them, and they block themselves out of relating to that person, or they don't want to communicate with that person or have a relationship. So what we do is just block them from anything, and I think that we should focus on having to deal with anyone, and we should show them what we really are about, and they will come to see what our culture is about, and we will be able to share it through our literature, art, corridos and folktales, we must share our story with them. So when they set up committees to Big Mountain, Navajos, Chicano, farm workers, or anyone, they can understand our racial fears and our ignorances. So we can all share our cultures.
Thank you, and thank you very much, panel. Viewers at home, have a good night.